Welcome to this podcast on architectural acoustics. This is the third podcast on Grasshopper, specified in relationship to packet acoustic simulation. We are building upon what we've done in the two earlier podcasts for Grasshopper, where we looked at including geometry from Rhino and material specification, how to compute and get analysis values out. And last podcast, we then started to include Grasshopper geometry, for a very simple division of the wall here. As you can see, that can of course take many different forms in your own projects in terms of much more, say, complex geometries and so forth. But for making it simple here, we just included simple geometry and showed how to include the Grasshopper geometry and the specification of the materials on the Grasshopper geometry through the layers in Rhino. And in this specific podcast, what I'll focus on is simply to show a way to visualize the rays in through Grasshopper. And so what we see here is there's a tab called Visualize Packet Rays. And when we then include that, we again have the room, the source, we have direction of the rays, we have the terminating surface of the ray, and then how many times do we want the rays to bounce off the surfaces. So again, if we then pull down the room, the source, so we have a point from which they go, and then we need the direction of the rays, and we need a terminating surfaces that is optional, and the number of bounces. Let's say we have the number of bounces to 5. Well, actually what we do is we put it in like this. And how to choose the direction? Well, the spreading is a geodesic or omnidirectional source, so the logic will be to base this on a sphere. So we can use the native component here of a sphere. What is the base? Well, we have that point from the surface, from the source. We have that here. So now we have a point in which we can spread the sound from. So this can be done in different ways, I'm sure, but now I'm simply doing it through a sphere. If you then subdivide that surface, which is the sphere, you will see here that obviously this here will cast many rays. So be cautious according to the kind of machinery that you have accessible to create a kind of spreading or a computational process that makes sense in relationship to your hardware. So now we have the point of all these, and then we can create the vector between the source and these points. So we have we have the source. We have all these points that will give us vectors, directions from the source to the points that are created on the surface. And we will then plug this into the direction of the source and then immediately get a spreading of the rays in that space. So here now we have, according to our settings here, and we'll see here how it bounces both off the Rhino geometry and the Grasshopper geometry. And we can then set down the number of rays, or how many times it bounces off the walls, as a way to understand the spreading of those bounces in the given space in respect to geometry and respect to the amount here. So you can tweak this in terms of covering the space, and here it is a quite good indication of how, depending on the basis of creating the rays, you will have a very different cover of the space over here due to the complexity of the space. Right, okay. So what we can do furthermore here is to say, well, can we start to visualize this a bit more clearly, because we have here 5 bounces. means we have 5 lines for each of the rays. So we here have a structure, data structure, where we have that is in response to the setting. We have the subdivision of the surface, a number of bounces, which will give us a series of rays. So if we explode this output to get each of the lines instead of a continuous polyline, let's simplify this to get a better structure. So if we can now start to understand here what. So here we have the first line or the first ray and the second one after the first bounce, and so forth. So now we start to have a different kind of reading of the spreading of the sound in respect to first, second, third order of the ray, bounced rays in space. And these you can of course start to then color or whatever you want to do to make your representation of this spreading of sound, improve that in terms of your specific projects. So as we go up, we will start to see the 4th, 5th order rays are starting to arrive here, whereas the first order rays, they are confined in the beginning of the space due to the nature of the geometry and the enclosure that we have included here. Another way, of course, is to map directly onto the points, the values of that we have computed in these points. So let's just see, we have, oh, I forgot to mention that you can of course include more simulation points than one, as we did before. So now I have included 2 points of reception, the one we saw in the earlier podcast here, and a second point here, and then it will compute from both these points, and we'll get a data structure in which these are nested in two different branches across the different frequencies. So here again we can of course say, let's take the first one. So we have a marker that is located here, and then we want the data of the reverberation time onto that point. And again, you can do this in different ways, and I'll just show one way to do this. So here we want in terms of reverberation time, you only want one set here, because here is for the first point and for the second point. So we will need to say we want the tree branch 0. So okay, we get here an error. Probably that is the data structure. And then we get the values out from that tree branch. Let's see. Okay, we need to spread the numbers out a bit more. Let's just. So this of course is the modeling task, but I'll just show it anyways. To give an example here of what you could do for the ones that are not so familiar with modeling in Grasshopper. Right, okay, so now we have the spreading of the numbers, the values of reverberation time across the different frequencies. And obviously now they are floating a little bit in space, but basically you then, of course, just simply change the position according to and size according to the settings of this setup here, and the colors and so forth. So that is just a bit more tweaking to do. I won't do it here because it's just a waste of time. But so a way to recap a little bit on this is simply we have a Grasshopper geometry setting, we have a Rhino setting that comes in here, we have the computation of the data, the values, acoustic values. We have a way to visualize the rays, how they are distributed in the space, either the whole raycast, the reflect line, or isolating each of the orders of the rays. And we can simply map the data now, of course not particularly elegantly modeled here, but we can simply map the data onto the point to get a better understanding if we have multiple points, as in this case also here and here. What data or what values are at these specific points. When you change your geometry, you will then see, of course, a recalibration of the values relationship to your development of the design. So this was the third and for now last podcast on pachyderm acoustics using Rhinoceros and Grasshopper. Thank you for watching this podcast.